I got kicked out for refusing to sell my dead grandfather's beef farm to pay for stepsister's college. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and realize everyone's already made a decision about your life without you? Yeah, that was my Tuesday afternoon. The dining room table looked like a battlefield after the fighting stopped. On one side sat an acceptance letter from Yale, all cream-colored paper and fancy letterhead, congratulating my stepsister Ashley on her admission. On the other side, a stack of papers from Horizon Development Corporation, each page screaming dollar signs in legalese. Between them, my stepfather Mark rubbed his eyes like a man who'd been rehearsing this conversation in the shower for weeks. My name is Andy. I stood in the doorway holding a jar of honey from Grandpa's old hives. Still wore my work gloves. Smelled like beeswax and propolis. The silence pressed down like humidity before a storm. Mark looked up. Didn't quite meet my eyes. That told me everything before he opened his mouth. Ashley sat beside him, scrolling through her phone with that particular brand of teenage indifference that could cut glass. She glanced at me once, then went back to whatever was more important on that screen, probably already shopping for dorm room furniture. I set the honey jar down on the counter. The sound echoed. Mark cleared his throat and pushed the developer's documents toward the empty chair across from him. The gesture reminded me of a poker player going all in. Calm, practiced, terrifying. The thing about family meetings is nobody ever calls them that until it's too late. Mom died 3 years ago. Lung cancer. Never smoked a day in her life. Just bad luck and bad cells. Before that, it was always Sunday dinners with laughter and Grandpa's stories about the farm during the Great Depression. After Mom passed, Mark sold the main house where we'd all lived together. Said it was too full of memories. Moved us into his modern place in town, all glass and stainless steel, where nothing smelled like home. Grandpa's old farm sat 20 miles outside town, slowly returning to weeds and wildlife. The farmhouse where Mom grew up, where I spent every summer learning about bees and soil and patience, where Grandpa taught me that hard work meant something when you did it for the right reasons. Mark finally spoke. His voice had that careful, measured tone people use when they're trying to sound reasonable while doing something unreasonable. He told me to sit down, told me we needed to talk like adults. The word adults hung in the air like an accusation. I was 22, working part-time at the hardware store, spending my free time trying to revive Grandpa's beehives. Not exactly the American dream my stepfather had in mind for his family. He explained it like a business presentation, though I noticed his thumb nervously picking at the edge of the table. Ashley got into Yale. Full ride was not quite full. They needed money for living expenses, books, the right laptop, networking opportunities. An Ivy League education was an investment in the future. A real future, he said, not some hobby farm fantasy. Then came the pitch. Horizon Development wanted both properties, his land and Grandpa's farm, for a new subdivision. Premium homes starting in the high six figures. They were offering $2.3 million for the combined parcels. Mark already agreed to sell his portion, but he needed my signature on Grandpa's land. The land Mom inherited. The land that became mine when she died. He slid the papers closer. Told me my share would be $460,000 after taxes and fees. Life-changing money. He called it. Money I could use to go back to college. Start a real business. Stop playing farmer with bugs. His words, not mine. Playing farmer with bugs. I looked at those papers and saw columns of numbers that meant nothing. Legal descriptions of property boundaries that reduced 80 acres of memory to meets and bounds. Schedule A, Exhibit B, parcel July 14th, 23. Like you could stuff my childhood into a filing cabinet. I thought about Grandma standing in the kitchen, flour up to her elbows, teaching me to knead bread. Thought about Mom reading on the porch swing while bees hummed in the clover. Thought about Grandpa showing me how to smoke a hive, his hands steady and sure, explaining that bees weren't something you conquered, but something you understood. For them, this farm was just an asset in an Excel spreadsheet, a line item to be liquidated. They didn't hear Grandma's laugh still echoing in those walls. Didn't smell the particular combination of honey and old wood that meant home. Didn't understand that some things mattered more than their market value. Mark and Ashley saw square footage and potential ROI, net present value of future cash flows. I saw the place where I learned who I wanted to be. I shook my head. Slowly. Once. Mark's jaw tightened. He wasn't angry yet, but I could see it coming like headlights on a dark road. He tried the reasonable approach again. Reminded me that property taxes were overdue, that the farmhouse needed a new roof, that the barn was one strong wind from collapse, that I was barely scraping by at the hardware store. That sentiment didn't pay bills. All true, every word, and none of it mattered. Ashley finally looked up from her phone. Her expression mixed pity and contempt in equal measure, a look she perfected since Mom died. She said I was being an idiot, said it was just old land, said I was holding up her future for dirt and broken down buildings that nobody wanted anyway. Just old land. I felt something shift in my chest. That moment when you realize your family doesn't actually know you at all. When you understand that the people sitting across from you are strangers who happen to share a last name and some history. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. Told Ashley that for her, maybe it was just land. For me, it was home. Simple as that. Started walking toward the door. Had my hand on the knob when Mark's voice changed. The reasonable businessman disappeared. What replaced him was colder, harder, more honest. He laid it out flat. I had until Friday to sign. 5 days. If I didn't, he'd file a petition lawsuit as a majority stakeholder under Mom's will, force a sale through the courts. In petition cases, the court usually sided with the party wanting to sell. I'd lose the farm anyway, wouldn't see a penny, and would get stuck with legal fees that would bury me. His lawyer already confirmed it. Open and shut case. He was trying to be nice by offering me something. But nice had an expiration date, and we were almost there. The truly wild part? He wasn't bluffing. I could see it in his eyes. Mark was a CPA who specialized in estate planning. He knew exactly how this would play out, had probably already drafted the paperwork. I stood there with my hand on that doorknob, feeling the weight of 3 generations pressing down on my shoulders. Grandpa built that farm from nothing during the Depression. Grandma kept it running when he went to war. Mom grew up there, met my dad there, brought me there every summer to learn the old ways. And now some developer wanted to bulldoze it for houses with granite countertops and HOA fees. Friday, 5 days to surrender or lose everything anyway. Ashley went back to her phone. Guessed the drama was over for her. She made some comment about how I'd thanked him later when I wasn't broke and bitter. How I'd see this was a mature choice. The word mature coming from a 17-year-old who'd never worked a day in her life felt like a slap, but I didn't have the energy to respond. Mark stood up, walked to the kitchen, came back with keys. Old brass keys on a faded John Deere keychain. I recognized them immediately. Grandpa's truck keys. The 1987 Ford F-150 that somehow still ran despite having 200,000 miles and more rust than paint. He tossed them to me. Said I could stay at the farm until Friday if I wanted. Live in my junk pile. He called it. Maybe the cold would clear my head, help me see reason, figure out what actually mattered in life. The keys felt heavy in my hand, heavier than keys should feel. I looked at Mark and Ashley one more time. Really looked, tried to find some trace of the family we used to be. Some hint that they understood what they were asking me to give up. Found nothing, just impatience and certainty and the absolute conviction that they were right. So I left. The drive out to Grandpa's farm took 30 minutes through back roads I could navigate blind. Past Miller's gas station where Grandpa used to buy lottery tickets every Friday. Said it was cheaper than therapy. Past the turnoff to the old swimming hole where Mom taught me to float. Past the church where we held both their funerals. Evening was coming on. That particular October light that turns everything gold and makes you believe the world might actually be beautiful if you could just stop thinking for a minute. The farm looked worse than I remembered. I'd been out here 3 weeks ago to check the hives, but somehow in that short time, it had aged years. The driveway was more pothole than pavement. The fence posts leaned like old men. The farmhouse itself stood defiant but tired, white paint peeling in long strips, shutters hanging crooked, the porch sagging in the middle. But the hives. God, the hives. Grandpa's apiary sat in the back meadow, a dozen white boxes arranged in neat rows. Most were empty now. The colonies collapsed or absconded over the years of neglect. But 3 of them still hummed with life. I'd been nursing them back, learning from Grandpa's old notebooks, making every mistake possible and some impossible ones. Those 3 hives were my proof of concept, my evidence that this place could live again. I parked the truck and sat for a minute, watching the sun drop below the tree line. Shadows stretched across the meadow like fingers. The temperature was already dropping. October in the Midwest meant cold nights, and the farmhouse had no heat except the old wood stove. No electricity either. Mark had the power cut off 2 years ago to save money. Grabbed my backpack from the truck bed. Had a sleeping bag, some clothes, a flashlight, box of granola bars. Everything I owned that mattered fit in one bag. Funny how that worked. The front door stuck. Had to shoulder it open. Inside smelled like dust and memories and something else, something harder to name. Absence, maybe. The smell of a place where people used to live but didn't anymore. The floorboards growing under my boots with every step, the sound loud in the dead air. I set up in Grandpa's old bedroom on the 2nd floor. Seemed right somehow. The mattress was gone, but I found his old quilt in the closet, wrapped in plastic, smelling like mothballs and beeswax and time itself. That smell hit me like a freight train. Suddenly I was 8 years old again, sick with the flu, and Grandpa was tucking the same quilt around me, telling me stories about the farm during the war years when sugar was rationed and beekeeping was considered essential work. Spread the sleeping bag on the floor, laid out the quilt on top, sat down with my back against the wall, and looked around the empty room. No furniture, no pictures on the walls, just outlines in the dust where things used to be. The sun finished setting. Darkness came on fast and complete, the kind of dark you only get miles from town. No streetlights, no neighbors, just stars and silence and the wind picking up outside. I thought about Mark's offer. $460,000. Enough to pay off student loans I'd accumulated before dropping out. Enough for a down payment on a house. Enough to stop living paycheck to paycheck. Enough to stop being the family embarrassment. Enough to stop fighting. That was the real offer, wasn't it? Not money. Permission to quit. Permission to admit that holding on to this place was stupid and sentimental, and exactly the kind of thing that kept people poor. The wind rattled the windows. Old glass and older frames, wavy and imperfect. Through them, I could barely make out the shapes of the hives in the meadow. My 3 surviving colonies, huddled against the coming winter. Bees don't think about money. Don't worry about property values or petition lawsuits or disappointing their families. They just work, gather nectar, make honey, protect the queen, prepare for winter. Simple purposes, perfectly executed. Grandpa used to say that bees had it figured out in a way humans never would. Said we complicated everything with wanting more than we needed. Said the secret to happiness was knowing the difference between enough and everything. I pulled the quilt tighter around my shoulders. The house creaked and settled. Wind found gaps in the walls I didn't know existed, brought the cold with it. My phone buzzed. Text from Mark. Just a screenshot of the petition lawsuit template his lawyer sent over. No message, just the implication. This is what happens if you don't sign. I turned the phone off. Didn't want to look at it anymore. Lay back on the sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling. In the darkness, I could almost see Grandpa's face, weathered and kind, hands that could gentle a bee or rebuild an engine, voice like gravel and honey. If he were here, what would he say? Would he tell me to fight? To let it go? Would he understand why I couldn't just sign those papers and walk away? The temperature kept dropping. I could see my breath now, little clouds in the flashlight beam. My fingers felt numb. I could feel the biting cold seeping up from the floorboards, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Should have brought better gear. Should have planned better. Story of my life lately. Somewhere in the walls, mice scurried. The house was full of small sounds, all the noises of a place slowly falling apart. settling, surrendering to time and weather and neglect. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe this was just stubbornness. Maybe I was holding on to something that was already gone, had been gone since Grandpa died, and I just didn't want to admit it. Maybe $460,000 was enough. Maybe I could build something new instead of protecting something old. Maybe. But lying there in the dark, wrapped in Grandpa's quilt, smelling the particular smell of that old house, I couldn't make myself believe it. This place mattered. Not because it was profitable or practical or made sense on a spreadsheet. It mattered because it was the last thing I had that connected me to the people I loved. The last place where I felt like I belonged somewhere. Losing it would mean losing them again. All of them. Grandpa, Grandma, Mom. Every Sunday dinner and summer afternoon, and lesson learned in the apiary. Gone. Replaced by numbered lots and suburban lawns, and people who'd never know what stood here before. I thought about the bees again. My 3 hives, fighting through fall, preparing for winter. They didn't have much. Small colonies, limited stores, old equipment. But they were surviving, doing the work, building something day by day, cell by cell. Maybe that was enough. Maybe survival was the victory. The wind picked up again, howling down the chimney, rattling through the eaves. The house groaned under the assault, sounded tired. Sounded like it was asking permission to quit too. I closed my eyes, tried to sleep, failed. Hours passed. The cold worked its way through the sleeping bag, through the quilt, through my clothes. I was shivering now, teeth chattering, curled up tight trying to conserve heat. Started to wonder if Mark was right about the cold clearing my head. Started to wonder if hypothermia counted as clarity. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep. Sat up, wrapped the quilt around my shoulders, and pulled out my phone. Turned it on. 17 missed calls. 12 texts. All from Mark. The last one came an hour ago. Last chance to be smart about this. Friday is coming whether you're ready or not. I almost threw the phone against the wall. Almost. But I needed the flashlight, so I just turned it off again and sat there in the darkness, listening to the wind and the mice and my own breathing. This was it. The last stand, the moment where I either folded and walked away with some dignity intact, or dug in and lost everything trying to save something that maybe couldn't be saved. 5 days. Friday. That's all I had. And sitting there in the cold and the dark, wrapped in my dead grandfather's quilt, I didn't have a single idea what to do next. No plan, no strategy, no miracle waiting in the wings. Just stubbornness and sentiment, and the absolute certainty that I couldn't sign those papers. Not Friday. Not ever. Even if it meant losing. I pulled the quilt tighter. Tried to remember the warmth of summer. The sound of bees. The taste of fresh honey. Try to remember Grandpa's voice telling me stories. Try to remember why I thought I could do this. The words came out before I could stop them. Whispered into the darkness. Cracked and desperate and completely honest. Grandpa, am I doing this right? What'd I do now? The house didn't answer. The wind kept blowing. The cold kept coming. And I sat there, 22 years old and completely alone, waiting for morning and Friday and whatever came after. Waiting for an answer that probably wasn't coming. Waiting to find out if stubbornness was enough. If love was enough. If any of this mattered at all. The question hung in the freezing air, unanswered. And the night stretched on forever. Morning came without permission, the way it always does when you haven't slept. Sunlight leaked through the gaps in the curtains, turning the dust in the air into golden static. My body felt like someone had beaten it with a sock full of quarters. The sleeping bag had done exactly nothing to protect me from the floor, and my back screamed every time I tried to move. I was 22 going on 70, rolled out of the bag and stumbled downstairs. No coffee, no running water, no nothing. Just me in a farmhouse that was falling apart in slow motion, proving Mark's point one creaky board at a time. Outside, the morning had that crisp October bite that reminds you winter's coming whether you're ready or not. The meadow stretched out behind the house, covered in frost that sparkled like broken glass. My 3 hives sat in their row, little white fortresses against the tree line. Smoke from a chimney rose in the distance. The Hemlock place. I'd forgotten about Old Man Hemlock. Grandpa's neighbor for 40 years. They'd shared equipment, traded labor, argued about everything from politics to the best way to control aphids. After Grandpa died, Hemlock stopped coming around. Grief makes people do weird things. Sometimes that means avoiding the places that remind you. I was heading toward the hives when I heard boots crunching through the frost behind me. Hemlock looked exactly like his name suggested. Tall, weathered, sharp around the edges. Had to be pushing 75, but moved like a man 20 years younger. The kind of tough that comes from a lifetime of physical work. His face was all hard angles and sun damage. Eyes the color of old denim. He stopped at the property line, one hand resting on a fence post that was more rust than metal. Didn't say hello. Just stood there looking at me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. Finally he spoke. Said he heard I was digging in my heels. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when it involved money and family drama. Probably half the county knew about my standoff with Mark by now. Hemlock explained it without preamble, the way old farmers do when they're too tired for pleasantries. Horizon Development wanted both properties together. His land and Grandpa's, a combined package. Something about the way the parcels lined up made them worth more as a set than separate. Economics of scale, or some garbage like that. He'd been trying to sell for 6 months. Ready to retire, move closer to his daughter in Arizona, spend his remaining years not breaking his back. But the developer wouldn't buy his land without mine. Package deal or no deal, which meant my stubbornness was blocking his retirement. He didn't sound angry exactly, more like exhausted, frustrated, the tone of a man who'd been ready to cross the finish line and found someone standing in his way. He told me not to be a fool like my grandfather. Said Grandpa held on to this dust until the very end, wouldn't listen to reason, died poor and tired with nothing to show for it but dirt and regret. Said I was making the same mistake, just 30 years later. The words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. Grandpa did die broke, did work himself into an early grave, did spend his last years watching the farm slowly fail while he refused every offer to sell. But Hemlock didn't understand what I understood, didn't see what I saw. Grandpa wasn't poor. He had something worth more than money. He had purpose, freedom, a life lived on his own terms. I tried to explain this, fumbled through some half-coherent speech about legacy and meaning and not everything being about dollars. Hemlock just shook his head, the way you do when you're watching someone make a preventable mistake. He told me I had 4 days left before Mark's deadline. Said I should think real hard about whether my pride was worth destroying both our futures. Then he turned and walked back toward his house, shoulders bent under the weight of all those years. I stood there in the frost, feeling like the world's biggest jerk. Hadn't even occurred to me that my fight might hurt someone else. Hadn't thought past my own situation to see the bigger picture. Turns out being principled is a lot easier when you're the only one paying the price. Spent the next few hours working the hives, trying to clear my head. Beekeeping is meditative when you let it be. Slow movements, focus attention, respect for something bigger than yourself. Grandpa always said working with bees taught you patience, whether you wanted to learn it or not. Open up the first hive. The colony looked weak. Not enough bees for this time of year. The brood pattern was spotty, which meant the queen was either old or sick. Check the second hive. Same story. Third hive was better, but still struggling. As I worked, I found myself staring at the old king hive at the end of the row. Heavier than the others. Built different. Grandpa used a joke about it when I was a kid, tapping its thick walls and saying something about fortresses and secret passages. I'd laughed it off as old man rambling. The kind of poetic nonsense that made good stories but meant nothing. Now it just looked like another dying piece of the past. None of them had enough honey stored for winter. At this rate, all 3 colonies would starve before spring. I'd been so focused on the symbolic fight, the principle of the thing, that I'd neglected the actual work. These bees were dying on my watch while I played farmer, without knowing what I was doing. Grandpa's notebooks could only teach me so much. Experience was a real teacher, and I didn't have enough of it. Mark's voice echoed in my head. Playing farmer with bugs. Hobby, not a business. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was in over my head. Maybe this whole thing was just ego dressed up as principle. Close up the hives and walk back to the house, feeling defeated. For days until Friday. 90 days until the tax auction. A neighbor I was hurting. Bees I was failing. A family that thought I was an idiot. Starting to think they might be onto something. The mailbox sat at the end of the driveway, leaning at a 45-degree angle, rust eating through the metal like cancer. I hadn't checked it in weeks. Hadn't seen the point. Who sends mail to a condemned property? But something made me open it that afternoon. Instinct, maybe. Or just the universe's sense of timing. Inside was a single envelope. Official. County seal in the corner. The kind of mail that's never good news. Ripped it open standing right there by the road. Read it twice because the first time couldn't be real. Property tax delinquency notice. 2 years of back taxes. Apparently, when Mark took over managing Mom's estate, some payments fell through the cracks. And I knew with a sudden, sickening certainty this was no accident. This was Mark's checkmate. A CPA specializing in estates wouldn't just let a payment slip. He'd been letting this debt grow, a quiet time bomb set to go off right when I was most vulnerable. Even if I fought off his lawsuit, even if I convinced him to back down, the county would finish what he started. The amount was $6,347. Not a fortune by most standards. But for a guy making $12 an hour at the hardware store, working part-time, with exactly $216 in his checking account, might as well have been $1 million. The notice was very clear about the timeline. 90 days to pay in full or the property would be seized and sold at public auction to cover the debt. Today was day one. I stood there holding that letter, feeling the world tilt sideways. This was it, the real threat. Not Mark's lawsuit, not Hemlock's guilt trip, not even the dying bees. Bureaucracy, the cold, impersonal machinery of government that didn't care about principles or legacy or dead grandfathers. Pay up or lose everything. Simple math. No negotiation. And the truly beautiful part? Even if I convinced Mark to back off, even if I found a way to save the Favre and the family, the county would take it anyway. I'd win the battle and lose the war to a tax bill I couldn't pay. The irony was so perfect, it almost made me laugh. Almost. I walked back to the house in a daze, that letter feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The sun was already dropping toward the horizon. October days were short, getting shorter. Winter was coming fast. Inside, I sat at Grandpa's old kitchen table. Solid oak, hand-built, probably weighed 300 pounds. The kind of furniture that outlasted generations. Scars and burns and water rings told stories I'd never know. This table had seen births and deaths, celebrations and arguments, the full spectrum of human experience compressed into a grain. I spread out the tax notice on the scarred surface, stared at it, willed the numbers to change. They didn't. 90 days, 13 weeks, 3 months to come up with $6,000. I did the math in my head. At $12 an hour, 30 hours a week, after taxes, I was bringing home maybe $360. Rent on my apartment in town, which I'd have to keep because I couldn't actually live here full-time without heat or water, was $600 a month. Food, gas, phone, the basics of modern existence, call it another $400. I was already running a deficit. Had been for months, burning through the tiny savings account Mom left me. Even if I worked full-time, picked up extra shifts, didn't eat, didn't drive, didn't exist, I still couldn't come up with $6,000 in 90 days. The math didn't work. Simple as that. I wanted to scream, wanted to flip the table, wanted to set something on fire. But I just sat there, numb, watching the last light fade from the windows. This was how you lost. Not in some dramatic showdown. Not fighting for what you believed in. You lost the paperwork and deadlines and numbers that didn't add up. Died by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts while the people who care about you shook their heads and said they told you so. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe I should have signed on Monday. Taken the money. Walked away before the hole got deeper. But it was too late for that now. The deadline was Friday. Even if I wanted to surrender, I'd already burned 3 days. And something stubborn in me, something that sounded a lot like Grandpa's voice, refused to quit even when quitting made sense. Evening turned to night. I lit a camping lantern I brought from town, the kind with the propane canister that hisses while it glows. Set it in the middle of the table. The light threw shadows on the walls, made the empty house feel even emptier. Started going through Grandpa's things. Not snooping exactly. More like searching for something. What I didn't know. Answers maybe. Permission to quit. A miracle. Found his old beekeeping journal in a drawer. Leather-bound. Pages yellowed, smelling like honey and thyme. His handwriting was cramped and practical. The script of a man who wrote only what mattered. Flipped through the entries. Most were technical. Notes about hive inspections, honey yields, weather patterns. But scattered throughout were other things. Observations. Philosophy. The kind of thoughts a man writes down when he's alone with his work and his mortality. One entry caught my eye. Written maybe 10 years before he died. It said that beekeeping taught him the difference between controlling something and understanding it. Said most people spent their lives trying to control everything, and that's why they were miserable. Bees couldn't be controlled, could only be understood, worked with, respected. He wrote that the secret to happiness was knowing what you could change and what you had to accept. That wisdom was just knowing where that line was. I sat there reading his words, feeling them settle into my bones. Grandpa had figured something out that most people never learned. Had found peace not through winning, but through understanding what was worth fighting for. But right now I didn't feel wise. Just tired and scared and broke. Kept reading. More entries about bees and seasons and the rhythms of the farm. Then, near the back, something different. A sketch. Rough, barely recognizable, but definitely a hive. Not a normal drawing, though. This one showed the internal structure, the frames, the walls, and something else. A notation that didn't make sense. The sketch showed a double-wall construction on the back panel of what Grandpa labeled as the Old King Hive. That was the oldest one in the apiary. Been there since the Depression. I'd noticed it was built heavier than the others, but figured it was just old-school craftsmanship. Overbuilt because that's how they did things back then. But this drawing suggested something else. Showed the back wall as 2 separate panels with a gap between them. Why would you build a hive that way? Extra insulation, maybe? But that didn't track. The gap was too narrow for meaningful insulation, and the notation next to it said something cryptic. Check foundation when swarm departs. I read it 3 times. Made no sense. Swarms happen in spring, when a colony got too big and split. The old queen left with half the bees to start a new home. But what did checking the foundation have to do with anything? And why write it in code like that? Unless it wasn't about bees at all. The thought hit me like cold water. I sat up straight, staring at that sketch. What if swarm departing didn't mean bees? What if it meant family? What if it meant exactly what happened when Grandpa died and we all scattered? Check the foundation when the swarm departs. My heart started hammering. This was crazy. I was reading meaning into random notes written by a man who'd been dead for 5 years. Seeing patterns where none existed. The stress was making me paranoid, but I couldn't shake it. Couldn't unsee what I was seeing. Grabbed a lantern and ran outside. The night was black as ink, no moon, just stars scattered like thrown dice. The frost had hardened into ice. My breath came out in clouds. I didn't care. Ran to the apiary. The Old King Hive sat at the end of the row, bigger than the others, paint flaking off, with weathered gray. I'd been inside it 12 times. Never noticed anything unusual. Set the lantern down and inspected the hive more carefully. Ran my hands over the back wall. Solid, heavy, but now that I was looking for it, I could feel something. A seam maybe? So faint I might have been imagining it. Looked closer. There, hidden under decades of paint and dirt, the outline of a panel, separate from the main wall, held in place by something I couldn't see in the dark. My hands were shaking. From cold or excitement or fear, couldn't tell. This was insane. There was nothing here. Just an old hive and my desperate imagination. But Grandpa's words echoed in my head. Something he'd said when I was maybe 12, 13 years old. We'd been working this exact hive. I'd asked why it was so much heavier than the others. He'd tapped the back wall with his knuckle, smiled that mysterious smile he had when he was teaching a lesson I wouldn't understand until later. Said every hive was a fortress. Said every good fortress had a secret passage. At the time, I thought he was being poetic. Grandpa talked like that sometimes, turning simple things into metaphors. Made beekeeping sound like philosophy. Made farming sound like warfare. But standing there in the dark, holding that tax notice in my pocket, staring at a hive that might contain something or nothing, I wondered if he'd been completely literal. Every good fortress has a secret passage. I looked back at the farmhouse. One light glowing in the window. Grandpa's house. Grandpa's land. Grandpa's hives. Grandpa's secrets. For days until Mark's deadline. 90 days until the auction. A neighbor I was hurting. Bees I was failing. A mystery I might be inventing. But what if I wasn't? What if Grandpa had left something behind? Not money necessarily, but something. Anything that could help. I was grasping at straws. I knew that. Desperate people see hope in shadows because the alternative is surrender. Still, the way that panel felt under my fingers, the diagram in his journal, the cryptic notation, his smile when he talked about fortresses and secret passages. Maybe I was crazy. Probably I was crazy. But crazy was all I had left. I stood there in the frozen meadow, lantern light flickering, staring at an old beehive that suddenly felt like the only thing between me and complete failure. The tax notice crinkled in my pocket. 90 days. The clock was already ticking. And somewhere in my memory, Grandpa winked and said something about fortresses and secret passages and checking the foundation when everyone else had left. I didn't know what I'd find when I opened that hive. Maybe nothing. Probably nothing. But I was going to look. Because when you're down to your last option, even a long shot starts looking like a plan. Tomorrow, I'd come back tomorrow with tools and daylight, and whatever courage I could scrape together. Tonight, I needed to think. Needed to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. Needed to believe that Grandpa, who'd never let me down in life, might have left me one last gift in death. A secret passage. A hidden foundation. Something. Anything. The wind picked up, cutting through my jacket, reminding me that winter was coming whether I was ready or not. The hive sat silent in the darkness, keeping their secrets. I walked back to the farmhouse, that journal entry burning in my mind. Check the foundation when the swarm departs. For days. 90 days. One old hive. One desperate hope. The clock was ticking, and I was out of time to do anything but believe. Morning came too slow and too fast at the same time. I'd spent the night on that cold floor, mind racing through possibilities and impossibilities in equal measure. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that diagram. The double wall, the cryptic note. Check the foundation when the swarm departs. By the time gray light filtered through the windows, I convinced myself a dozen times that I was chasing ghosts, and a dozen times that I wasn't. The journal sat on the table, where I'd left it, leather-worn smooth by decades of Grandpa's hands. I picked it up and started from the beginning, reading every entry with new eyes, looking for patterns, clues, anything that might confirm I wasn't losing my mind. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Technical notes about hive management, weather observations, honey yields by season, the meticulous record-keeping of a man who took his work seriously. But scattered throughout, almost hidden, were other things. Comments that seemed random at first glance, but started forming a pattern once you looked closer. An entry from 40 years ago mentioned moving the old king hive to its current location, said it needed to be positioned where he could keep an eye on it. Strange phrasing for a beehive. Why would you need to watch it more carefully than the others? Another entry, dated 15 years later, talked about reinforcing the foundation. Used quotes around the word foundation, like it meant something else. Something more. I kept flipping pages. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I didn't care. Somewhere in these worn pages was the answer. Had to be. Then I found it. The entry I'd seen last night, but this time I read what came before it. A note dated 2 weeks after Grandma died. Grandpa's handwriting looked shakier than usual, grief bleeding through the ink. He wrote about how the Depression had taught him that everything could be taken. Jobs, homes, dignity. Said he'd watched good men lose everything because they trusted systems that failed them. Banks collapsed. Savings evaporated. Paper promises turned to ash. So he'd kept something real. Something that couldn't be devalued by government policy or market crashes. Something solid. The next page had the diagram. The double-walled construction. And below it, in Grandpa's careful script, the instructions I'd read last night took on new meaning. If swarm departs, check foundation. Old King holds the key. Not if the swarm departs. When, like he knew it would happen eventually, knew the family would scatter. Knew I might end up alone, fighting to keep this place alive. He left me a message in code. A test, maybe, or just insurance that the wrong person wouldn't stumble onto a secret by accident. My hands were shaking as I stood up. The chair scraped loud in the quiet house. This was it. Time to find out if I was brilliant or crazy. The walk to the apiary felt longer than it should have. Every step gave me another chance to turn back. Another opportunity to admit this was insane and go sign Mark's papers like a reasonable person. But reasonable people don't find hidden fortunes. Reasonable people play it safe and die wondering what if. The old King hive sat exactly where it always had, at the end of the row. In daylight, it looked completely ordinary. Just another white box in a field of white boxes. Nothing special about it except it was older and heavier than the rest. I knelt down beside it, ran my hands over the wood, feeling for anything unusual. The paint was flaking off in long strips, revealing gray wood underneath. Decades of weather had worn it smooth in some places, rough in others. Started at the back panel, the one from the diagram. Up close, I could see what I'd missed in the dark. Tiny gaps in the paint where it didn't quite line up. Seams hidden under layers of white that had been applied and reapplied over the years. Pressed against the wood. Testing. Solid. Heavy. Nothing moved. But then I remembered something. The diagram showed the latches hidden as knots. I looked closer at what I'd assumed were natural imperfections in the wood. 2 of them weren't knots at all. They were plugs. Wooden dowels fitted, so precisely you'd never notice unless you were looking. Got my utility knife from my pocket. Worked the blade under the edge of the first plug. It popped out easier than expected, revealing a small metal catch underneath. Simple, elegant, completely invisible unless you knew it was there. Found the second catch on the opposite side. Both needed to be released simultaneously. Grandpa wasn't taking chances. This required 2 hands in deliberate action. No way to trigger it by accident. Took a deep breath. This was the moment. Either I was about to prove myself right, or I was about to feel really stupid for destroying a perfectly good beehive based on paranoid theories and desperate hope. Pressed both catches at once. Heard a soft click. The back panel shifted. Just slightly. But enough. My heart hammered. So hard I could hear in my ears. Blood rushing. Adrenaline dumping into my system like I was about to fight or run. Slid the panel to the side. It moved smooth on hidden tracks, well-oiled despite the years. Grandpa had built this to last. Built it to be found, but only by someone who cared enough to look. Inside was darkness. A cavity between the false back and the real wall. Big enough to hide something. Big enough to matter. Reached in with trembling hands. Felt fabric. Heavy canvas or maybe old tarp. Grabbed it and pulled. A metal box emerged. Military surplus. Olive drab. The kind designed to protect contents from moisture and time. Must have weighed 30 pounds. Maybe more. I set it on the ground and just stared at it for a full minute. This was real. This was actually real. The latch was stiff but functional. Open with metallic click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet meadow. Inside, packed carefully, were layers wrapped in oilcloth. I peeled back the first layer. Photographs. Dozens of them. Grandpa in his army uniform, young and serious. Grandma on their wedding day, beautiful in a simple dress. Mom as a baby. Me as a kid, covered in mud, holding up a jar of honey like a trophy. Memories preserved like specimens. A life documented and protected. My throat tightened, kept going. Under the photos were documents, deeds, birth certificates, the paper trail of the family. Important, but not what I was looking for. Then, wrapped in what looked like an old towel, I found them. Coins. Rows of them, nestled in foam cutouts like eggs in a carton. Gold caught the morning light and threw it back warm and alive. Silver gleamed cool beside it. I lifted one out. Heavy, solid, real in a way paper money never could be. An American gold eagle, dated 1986. Pristine, uncirculated. Counted them. 50 gold coins, 100 silver, and beneath those, older coins in protective sleeves. Mercury dimes, Walking Liberty $50, Morgan silver dollars. Some looked like they'd been collected over decades. Others seemed chosen specifically, all of them valuable. But it was a note tucked beneath the last layer that stopped my breath. Unfolded it with shaking hands. Grandpa's handwriting, clear and strong. Written recently, maybe a few months before he died. Like he knew his time was running short and wanted to make sure this message reached me. Started reading. Had to stop twice because my eyes kept blurring. The note was addressed to me. Just me, not the family. Not whoever found it. Me specifically. Andy, he wrote, if you're reading this, it means you turned out stubborn like me. Means you didn't take the easy path when they tried to force you off this land. Good. That's exactly what I hoped. He explained that he'd lived through the Depression, watched his parents lose their farm, saw good people destroyed by economic forces they couldn't control, learned early that the only real security came from what you could hold in your hand. These coins represented his freedom, his insurance policy against a world that could take everything else. He'd added to the collection throughout his life. A coin here, a coin there, never so much that anyone would notice, never so little that it didn't matter. Said he could have sold them 1,000 times, could have used them to expand the farm, buy new equipment, live more comfortably, but that would have defeated the purpose. This wasn't money for spending. This was money for surviving, for that moment when everything else failed and you needed something real to stand on. He wrote that he'd lived the life he wanted, worked his own land, answered to nobody, made his own decisions. These coins bought him that freedom, not by spending them, but by knowing they existed, knowing he always had an escape hatch if the walls started closing in. Now they were mine, not for luxury, not for comfort, but to build something real, something that couldn't be taken away by bosses or banks or family members who didn't understand. The last paragraph hit hardest. Use this to build your life on your own terms, he wrote. But remember, real wealth isn't in gold. It's in having the freedom to choose. The power to say no when everyone else is telling you to surrender. Don't let anyone, ever, make you bow your head if your gut tells you to stand tall. That's what this is for. That's what it's always been for. I sat there in the grass beside that open hive, holding a note from a dead man who understood me better than the living, and cried like I hadn't cried since Mom's funeral. Not from relief, though that was part of it. From connection. From finally understanding what Grandpa had been trying to teach me all along. He hadn't left me money. He'd left me a philosophy, a way of seeing the world. The coins were just a tool. The real gift was a lesson. Don't live for money. Live for freedom. Build something that matters. Stand your ground when you know you're right. I thought about Mark's offer. $460,000 for surrendering everything that mattered. Thought about the tax bill. $6,000 that would take everything if I couldn't pay. Then looked at the box of coins in front of me. At decades of careful planning. At Grandpa's final gift. The math had just changed. Completely. Spent the next 3 days being very careful. Did research. Made calls. Found a reputable coin dealer 2 states over who specialized in estate evaluations. Told him I'd inherited a collection and needed it appraised. Didn't mention the hiding place or the circumstances. Just business. Drove out there on Wednesday with the coins packed carefully in the metal box. The dealer was an older guy. Reminded me a little of Grandpa. Careful hands. Sharp eyes. The kind of person who'd spent a lifetime studying details others missed. He examined each coin under magnification. Checked dates. Verified authenticity. Made notes in a leather-bound book that probably cost more than my truck. The process took hours. I sat in his office, drinking terrible coffee, watching him work. Every coin got the same meticulous attention. Every detail mattered. Finally, he looked up, took off his magnifying glasses, smiled. The gold alone was worth significant money based on weight and purity, he said. But several of the coins were rare dates, mint condition, collectible far above their metal value. The silver was similar, mix of common and rare, all of it well preserved. He gave me a number for the whole collection. Conservative estimate, he said. What he could sell it for at auction, with proper marketing. $5.2 million. I sat there, numb. That number didn't feel real. Couldn't be real. He saw my expression and smiled again. Said he'd seen this before. Family collections passed down. Hidden during hard times. Forgotten or rediscovered decades later. Said my grandfather clearly knew what he was doing. This wasn't random accumulation. This was purposeful well-preservation by someone who understood both coins and history. Asked if I wanted to sell. I said maybe, part of it. Needed to think. He understood. Gave me his card. Said to call when I was ready. Mentioned that moving this much value required careful planning for tax purposes and security. Offered to help navigate the process. I thanked him. Drove home with $5 million worth of metal in a box on my passenger seat, trying to process what this meant. Thursday morning, I did the math properly. Figure out what I actually needed versus what I had. Needed $6,000 for back taxes. Needed maybe another $10,000 for immediate repairs. Wanted a buffer for operating expenses while I built the apiary back up. Call it $50,000 to be safe. Plenty of cushion. Sold 20 silver coins to a local dealer for spot price plus a small premium. $14,000. More than enough. Kept the rest. Put it back in its hiding place in the old king hive, now with the back panel secured properly. That box contained my future, my security, my freedom to tell anyone who tried to push me around to go pound sand. Wasn't touching it unless absolutely necessary. Friday morning, Mark called. Asked if I was ready to be reasonable. Told him I'd made my decision. I was keeping the farm. The silence on the other end was delicious. Then anger. Threats about the lawsuit. About petition. About burying me in legal fees. I let him finish. Then said I'd be paying off Mom's estate taxes that afternoon. All of them. In full. The county would have their money by Monday. His leverage was gone. He sputtered. Asked how. Where I got the money. I told him that was none of his business. Said I'd see him in court if he wanted to pursue the lawsuit, but he should know I had resources now. Could afford lawyers just as good as his. The call ended badly. Didn't care. I'd won. Spent Friday afternoon at the county office. Paid the tax bill. Got a receipt. Asked for documentation that the property was current on all obligations. Filed it safely. Went to the bank. Opened a business account. Deposited the remaining money. Started making plans. Saturday, I started repairs. Fixed a leak in the barn roof. Replaced rotted boards. Cleaned out gutters. Small things that added up. The kind of maintenance that keeps a place alive instead of letting it die slowly. Sunday, I worked the hives. Fed them. Treated for mites. Started planning for next season. These 3 colonies would become 6. Then 12. Build it back slow and right. The farm was mine. Really mine. Free and clear. And the best part? Nobody knew why except me and Grandpa's ghost. Life got quiet after that. Good quiet. Productive quiet. Mark backed off. Probably realized the lawsuit was a loser once the tax issue disappeared. Without that pressure point, he had no angle. The will gave him majority control, but not unilateral authority. I could block the sale indefinitely if I wanted, Hemlock stopped by a few weeks later, brought coffee and an apology, said he'd been frustrated but understood now that I had my reasons. Asked if I'd figured something out. I said, yeah, something like that. We talked about farming and bees and the weather. Didn't mention the coins. Some things stayed private. Ashley went to Yale. Came home for Thanksgiving. Didn't mention the farm. We were polite. Distant. That was okay. Some bridges burned too hot. To rebuild quickly. Winter came. I worked part-time at the hardware store. Spent my free time planning. Reading Grandpa's journals. Learning everything he'd written down. Spring brought the real work. Expanded the apiary. 6 hives became 12. 12 became 20. I was learning. Getting better. Making mistakes but fewer than before. The honey was good. Really good. Wildflower and clover. The flavor of the specific land at the specific time. Bottled it in glass jars with simple labels. Sold it at the farmer's market. People noticed. Word spread. Started getting orders from restaurants. Then a local store wanted to carry it. Then another. By summer, I needed help. That's when Ashley showed up. Unannounced. Drove out on a Tuesday afternoon, looking like she'd lost a fight with her own life. She told me she'd taken a leave of absence from school. Said it was financial. Yale was expensive. More expensive than they planned. Mark had invested in some real estate development deal that went sideways. The $460,000 from his land sale, plus everything else, gone. Chasing returns. Got burned instead. Now there wasn't money for her second year. She needed to work. Save up. Maybe go back later. She said this while staring at her hands. Couldn't look at me. Shame and pride fighting it out on her face. I poured her tea. Local honey mixed in. Watched her taste it without comment. Asked if she knew anything about graphic design. She looked confused. Said she'd taken a class. Why? Told her my honey needed better labels. Needed a website. Needed someone to handle online orders and social media. Business was growing faster than I could manage alone. Offered her $18 an hour. Full-time if she wanted. Part-time if she preferred. Start Monday. She stared at me. Asked why I'd do this. After everything. After what she'd said. After how she'd treated me. I shrugged. Told her family was complicated. But working together might be less complicated than staying enemies. Said the farm was big enough for both of us if she was willing to actually work. She just looked at me for a long moment, tears welling in her eyes. Then she whispered, "Okay, Andy." "Okay." Started Monday. Showed up early. Worked hard. Turned out she was good at the business side. Better than me. Had ideas about branding and marketing that actually made sense. Within 6 months, Grandpa's Gold Honey was shipping nationwide. Within a year, we were profitable enough that I could pay myself a real salary. Pay Ashley a real salary. Hire 2 more part-time people. The farm was alive again. Different than Grandpa's time, but alive. Around that time, I heard about Hemlock's trouble. The developer had given up on getting my land. Now, they wanted just his property. But the offer had dropped. Way down. They knew he was desperate. Knew he had no other options. I thought about it for exactly 1 day. Then drove over. Found him on his porch. He looked older. Tired. The weight of 80 years and too many disappointments. Told him I'd heard about his situation. He waved it off. Said it was fine. I called his bluff. Said nothing about his situation looked fine. Made him an offer. I'd buy his land. Fair market price. Full value, not the developer's lowball garbage. But he could stay in his house for free. Life estate. Stay until he was ready to leave for Arizona or anywhere else. No rush. No pressure. He looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Asked why I'd do that. What I wanted with more land I couldn't farm. Told him the truth. Said I didn't need the land. But he needed the money. And I'd rather have a good neighbor than an empty house. Also said the land would be good for the bees. Plant it in clover and wildflowers. Turn it into a massive meadow. More forage meant more honey. More honey meant better business. Win-win, I said. He got his retirement money. I got better pasture. Everyone was happy. He sat quiet for a long time. then stood up, held out his hand. We shook. Deal done on a handshake, the old way. Lawyers handle the details later. But that handshake was the real contract. 2 years after finding those coins, I sat on my repaired porch. Evening coming on. October again. Full circle. The apiary had 40 hives now. Healthy. Productive. The honey was developing a reputation. We'd won awards. Got written up in magazines. Restaurants waited months for our seasonal batches. Ashley ran the business side. Had a real office in what used to be the spare bedroom. She'd moved into the farmhouse. Took over the upstairs. We split expenses. Worked together without killing each other. Mostly. Hemlock's land was a wildflower meadow now. Every spring it exploded in color. Every summer it hummed with bees. He came over sometimes. Drank tea on my porch. Told stories about farming with Grandpa. Mark had disappeared. Heard he'd moved somewhere south. Trying to rebuild after his investments collapsed. Didn't wish him ill. Didn't wish him well either. Some people just existed in your past. I held Grandpa's old cup. Chipped ceramic. Stained from decades of use. Filled with tea and local honey. Watched the sun drop toward the horizon. Golden light washing over everything. The farmhouse. The barn. The hives. All of it glowing like something out of a painting. Thought about Grandpa's note. About building a life on your own terms. About freedom not coming from money, but from the power to choose. The coins were still hidden in the old king hive. Most of them. My secret insurance policy. My escape hatch. Probably never used them. That wasn't the point. The point was knowing they were there. Knowing I always had options. That's what real wealth was. Not the money itself. The choices it enabled. The ability to say yes to what mattered and no to what didn't. Grandpa had said this fortune was for building something real. For never bowing your head when you knew you should stand tall. But sitting there on that porch, watching Ashley through the window as she worked on some new marketing campaign, seeing bees return to their hives as evening settled in, I realized he'd taught me something else too. Real wealth wasn't just standing tall yourself. It was helping others stand up too, giving people the chance to rebuild, to try again, to find their own path. Ashley had learned to work, learned humility, learned that fancy degrees meant nothing if you couldn't apply them to real problems. Hemlock got his retirement and his dignity, got to leave on his own terms instead of being forced out by predatory offers. I got my freedom, got to build something that mattered, got to prove that stubbornness wasn't the same as stupidity, and sometimes fighting losing battles was exactly how you won. The farm was mine. The future was mine. And I'd built it not by tearing others down, but by lifting them up when they fell. That was the real lesson hidden in that old hive. Not just about having enough. About knowing when enough meant sharing. When security meant community. When winning meant everyone got to keep their dignity. Finish my tea. Set the cup down gently. Grandpa's cup. On Grandpa's porch. On Grandpa's land. Except it wasn't his anymore. It was mine. And I'd earned it, not by inheriting it, by fighting for it, understanding it, protecting it when others wanted to destroy it. The bees were settling for the night, that saw them fading as darkness came on. Tomorrow they'd wake up and start again, gathering nectar, making honey, building their future, one cell at a time. Same as me, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of standing tall, when it would have been easier to bow. The stars were coming out. Same stars Grandpa saw. Same stars as Grandpa saw. Same stars my grandkids might see someday if I was lucky. And sitting there, I finally understood what he'd been trying to teach me all along. Real wealth wasn't about the gold hidden in that hive. It was about knowing when to stand and when to reach out a hand. When to fight and when to forgive. When to protect what's yours and when to share what you have. It was about building something that lasted, something that helped others find their footing too. That lesson was worth more than all the coins in the world. That lesson was worth everything.